Maggie Collins had lived in quiet sorrow since losing her husband to the sea. One winter morning, while walking her loyal German shepherd, Ranger, along the cliffs of Port Willow, she noticed something strange. The storm had torn open the ground beneath the old lighthouse, revealing a hidden cave whispering with the sound of rushing water. Drawn by a voice she couldn't explain, Maggie stepped inside and found traces of a forgotten world, ancient carvings, a glowing spring, and a secret tied to her own bloodline. As Blue Harbor Corporation closed in to claim the coast, Maggie and Ranger became the last defenders of faith, light, and legacy. What they uncovered beneath those waves wasn't gold, it was something eternal, a promise of hope, and the miracle God hides in those who dare to keep believing. What follows will move your soul, renew your faith, and remind you that even in darkness, God's light never fades. Before we begin, please subscribe, leave a like, and share this story with someone who needs a little light today. Chapter 1. The storm that opened the stone door. The wind still carried the taste of salt and broken shells when dawn rose over Port Willow. The nor'easter had passed in the night, leaving the sky pale and washed clean, like an old photograph. Along the ragged coastline, gulls wheeled over shattered lobster traps and driftwood tangled in seaweed. Maggie Collins walked the shore with slow, deliberate steps, her boots sinking into wet sand. Beside her trotted Ranger, her 7-year-old German shepherd, large, sable-colored, his fur dark at the back and silvered around the muzzle. His ears stood sharp as blades, his gait alert but loyal, as though guarding something fragile inside her. Maggie was 52, tall for a woman, with a wiry strength that spoke of years spent hauling nets and firewood. Her hair, once chestnut, had turned the color of storm clouds and was always tied back in a loose braid that defied the wind. The lines on her face were not merely of age, but of endurance, each one carved by sleepless nights, unpaid bills, and the silence of a house too large for one person. Her husband, Jim, had been gone 6 years, heart failure in the middle of mending a fence. Since then, she had lived alone with Ranger in the weather-beaten house on Cliff Road, where peeling paint and cracked windows looked out toward the Atlantic. She paused near the foot of the lighthouse cliff, where waves still crashed with a lazy violence. The old Port Willow lighthouse stood above her, a white tower streaked with rust and memory. Its keeper's windows were boarded, and the once bright lamp had been replaced by a cold, electric beacon controlled by the Coast Guard miles away. Maggie often thought the lighthouse looked lonely, like a man forgotten by his own century. Ranger barked suddenly, nose pressed toward a tumble of boulders near the base of the cliff. "What is it, boy?" Maggie followed, her breath visible in the chill morning air. Between two rocks, the storm had torn away a section of earth, revealing a narrow hollow that had not been there before. She crouched, brushed aside damp moss, and felt the cold draft breathing from the opening. It smelled of salt, rust, and something ancient, the scent of stone that had never seen light. Ranger pushed his snout in, sniffed, then sneezed so violently the sound echoed off the cliff like a foghorn. Maggie laughed for the first time in days. "Careful, sailor. Maybe Neptune himself's hiding in there." Yet as she peered into the darkness, her laughter thinned. Something about the narrow throat of that cave stirred a deep unease, an echo of memory she could not name. Behind them, a truck rumbled along the coastal road, its sides plastered with the shiny blue logo of Blue Harbor Development. The slogan read, "Sustainable growth for a brighter shoreline." Maggie watched it go, her jaw tightening. She knew that kind of promise. Blue Harbor's growth meant concrete where the dunes had been, luxury homes where fishermen once stored their traps. The company had already bought up half the northern bluff and was now eyeing the land near the lighthouse. She'd heard the council plan to sell it, to pay off the town's debts. She bent to pick up a soaked leaflet the wind had dropped on the sand. Future site of Blue Harbor Resort and Marina. Her throat burned with the bitter taste of irony. "Sustainable," she muttered. "For who?" Ranger nudged her hand with his wet nose, sensing the storm inside her. "Yeah, I know," she said softly. "Let's go home." But her eyes kept straying back to that hole in the cliff, to the black breath of air that whispered like a secret. When she reached the road, Eddie Callahan waved from across the street. He stood outside Gull's Diner, the small roadside cafe he'd run since his discharge from the Navy 20 years ago. Eddie was a thick-set man in his 50s, with a beard gone half white and arms tattooed with fading anchors. His laugh, when it came, was always a beat too loud, perhaps to drown the echo of shellfire that still haunted his dreams. "Morning, Mag." You survived the blow? He called. Barely, she replied, tucking her braid under her scarf. You lose power? Half the night, he said. But the coffee survived, thank God. You look like you could use one. Inside the diner, warmth and the smell of frying bacon wrapped around her like an old quilt. Only 2 other patrons sat in the corner, retired lobstermen arguing about whether the tide had ever been this high. Maggie sat at the counter. Eddie poured her coffee into a chipped blue mug. Heard the town council's meeting next week, he said casually. Word is they might sell the Lighthouse property. Maggie stared into her cup. Figures. They'll sell the soul of this place for a parking lot. Eddie shrugged, the kind of shrug that hides a bruise. World moves on, Mag. Gotta keep up or get swallowed. Some things shouldn't be swallowed, she said quietly. Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with something older. Grief sharpened into conviction. When she left the diner, the wind had softened. Mail waited in her box, bills, advertisements, and one envelope with handwriting she hadn't seen in years. Nora Collins, her younger sister. The postmark was from Boston. Maggie's fingers tightened on the paper before she even opened it. Nora's neat script read, We need to talk about the house. I think it's time we sold Mom's place. She stood there a long time, the letter fluttering in her hand. The same day the sea opened a new wound in the earth, her sister wanted to close the last piece of their family. Ranger whined softly, sensing her unease. Not now, she whispered. Not yet. That night, wind moaned again through the cracks of the old house. Maggie sat by the window, the unopened letter beside the lamp, her thoughts turning toward the cliff. The cave had appeared where the tide never reached, as though the sea had chosen that spot deliberately. She imagined the darkness beneath, cold and waiting. Ranger lifted his head suddenly and growled low in his throat. Maggie followed his gaze toward the window. Just for a moment, she thought she saw a faint light flicker near the lighthouse cliff. A shimmer like a lantern swinging once, then gone. Her breath caught. That can't be, she whispered. But Ranger kept staring into the night, ears rigid, tail stiff, as the wind outside began to hum again. Softly, almost like a voice calling her name. Chapter 2. The marks of the old hands and the spring beneath the stone. Morning fog clung to the cliffs like breath from the sea. Maggie stood once more at the base of the lighthouse bluff, the wind cutting through her coat, her gloved hand gripping a flashlight and a coil of rope. Ranger trotted ahead, tail up, nose twitching, as though he had dreamed of this place all night. The strange light she'd seen from her window lingered in her thoughts, half nightmare, half invitation. She'd told herself it was probably a reflection, maybe from a boat or a prank by teenagers, but something in her bones said otherwise. The tide was low, exposing wet rocks and patches of barnacle crust. The cave mouth waited exactly where it had been, a black wound in the cliff's pale face. Maggie crouched, tied the rope around a sturdy driftwood root, and whispered, "Stay close, sailor." Ranger wagged his tail, the light of her flashlight glinting in his amber eyes. Inside, the air was cool and metallic, humming faintly with the echo of dripping water. Her flashlight beam carved shapes out of darkness, arched ceilings, jagged walls streaked with salt. Every few feet, Ranger stopped to sniff, his paws leaving prints on the damp sand. The smell of sea and stone mixed with something else. Old smoke, faint and dry, like the ghosts of long-dead fires. Maggie's beam fell upon a wooden groove running along the rock floor. 2 parallel planks, eaten by rot, but still visible. She knelt, brushed them with her fingers. The texture was unmistakable. A track, she murmured, or a chute. She could picture barrels sliding down it decades ago, hidden from sight. Her father used to tell stories of smugglers who ran whiskey under the very noses of prohibition agents. She'd always thought they were folklore. Now, maybe not. Ranger barked softly, head cocked toward a deeper tunnel where the sound of dripping grew louder. They followed it, the air growing colder and damper, until the beam of her light caught a shimmer on the wall. Water seeped through a crack, forming a clear rivulet that spilled into a small basin carved into the stone. It was so clean, it looked like liquid glass. Maggie leaned closer. Beneath the surface, faint threads of light flickered, tiny dots of blue-green luminescence swaying gently, as if the water itself breathed. She gasped. What in the world? The light pulsed rhythmically, like the heartbeat of the cave. Ranger, ever curious, dipped his snout to sniff and, predictably, tried to lick. The moment his tongue touched the surface, He sneezed explosively and shook his head in dramatic offense. Maggie burst out laughing, the sound bouncing off the walls until it sounded like a dozen people laughing with her. "You're a fool, you know that?" she said, wiping tears from her eyes. When she shone her light higher, she noticed faint carvings etched into the stone above the basin. They were old, half eroded, but deliberate, an arrow pointing inward, a series of hash marks, 5 in a row, then a gap, then 5 more. And beneath them, the words barely visible through centuries of corrosion. 4 keepers, her heart thudded. Keepers of what? She whispered. She traced the letters with her fingertips, the stone cold against her skin. The phrase stirred something ancient in her, an echo of the men who once kept the lighthouse flame alive through storm and darkness. She imagined them hiding here, guarding contraband, or perhaps something sacred. A faint rustle echoed behind her. Maggie froze, switching off the light. The darkness swallowed her instantly. Ranger's ears pricked. His low growl rolled through the cave. For a long moment, there was nothing, only the drip of water. Then, faintly, she thought she heard it, the clatter of pebbles, as if a foot had slipped somewhere in the tunnel. She waited, every muscle taut. Silence returned. She exhaled shakily and whispered, "Probably the tide." But her pulse didn't slow for a long time. Later that afternoon, Maggie sat in the small radio booth above the Port Willow Library, adjusting the old microphone that smelled faintly of dust and coffee. Eddie Callahan had called her that morning, saying the town's community station was short, a host for its weekend Local Voices segment. She had hesitated, then agreed. Maybe it was a distraction she needed from the cave, and from Nora's letter she still hadn't answered. "Testing, 1, 2, she said. Her voice came back warm and steady through the headset. Eddie had been right. She had the kind of voice people trusted, a mix of husk and honey. The first broadcast went smoothly, birthdays, fishermen's updates, church bake sales. Yet, as she read, she felt something awaken inside her, a soft flicker like the glow in the cave's pool. She remembered being 12, telling stories by flashlight to her little sister on stormy nights, inventing pirates and sea witches. That had been before their parents' divorce, before silence had replaced laughter. When the show ended, a woman with bright gray eyes and a smile like sunlight approached the booth door. "You're Maggie Collins, right?" "I'm Sarah Donovan," she said, extending a hand. Sarah was in her late 40s, tall and slim, her hair a silver bob that made her look both modern and kind. She wore a wool peacoat and carried a clipboard filled with flyers. "I work with the Port Willow Historical Society. That lighthouse piece you mentioned, a symbol worth saving, that was beautiful." Maggie flushed slightly. "Thank you. I didn't mean to sermonize." Sarah laughed, low and genuine. "Please do. We need voices like yours. We're organizing a petition to protect the lighthouse property before Blue Harbor gets its claws in. Think about joining us." She handed Maggie a flyer with the society's seal, a stylized lantern encircled by waves. Ranger barked from outside, impatient as always. Maggie smiled faintly. "I'll think about it," she said, tucking the paper into her jacket. That night, she returned home and placed the flyer beside Nora's letter. 2 paths, one looking forward, one pulling back. As she sat by the window, she caught herself glancing toward the cliff again. The fog had rolled in thick, erasing the horizon. Yet through it, she thought she saw a faint shimmer near the lighthouse, like light glancing off water where there should have been none. Ranger growled softly from the porch, hackles raised. Maggie stood, her pulse quickening. "Easy, boy." But when she stepped outside, the shimmer was gone. Only the slow roar of waves answered her. Still, deep down, she could feel it. The cave hadn't finished with her. Not yet. Chapter 3. The Silver Chest and the Forgotten Deed. The morning the sea pulled back farther than anyone could remember, Maggie felt the air charged with something uncanny, as if the tide itself had paused to breathe. The fog had lifted overnight, leaving the horizon naked and glittering. Down by the cove, the rocks glistened like black glass, and gulls strutted on the wet sand, bewildered by the retreating ocean. Ranger barked from ahead, his paws splashing in shallow pools left by the tide. He looked excited, ears pricked, tail wagging like he had discovered treasure. Maggie followed the direction of his nose and saw it. Half buried behind a curve of rock was the corner of a wooden chest, its metal bands tarnished green from years under salt. She dropped to her knees, brushing away the wet sand. The lid was wedged tight, swollen with age. "Hold on, boy," she muttered, wedging her hands beneath the edge and heaving until it cracked open with a groan. Inside, she expected driftwood or stone, but instead, her flashlight glinted off silver coins scattered like dull stars, along with a bundle of paper sealed in wax and a leather-bound journal blackened with mildew. A faint scent of oil and brine rose from within. The pages inside were written in looping script, dated 1873, signed by Elias Harper, assistant keeper of Port Willow Light. Maggie's breath caught. She remembered the name from an old plaque her father used to show her. Elias Harper had been the man who rescued sailors during the Great Blizzard of 1880, vanishing a year later without a trace. The last entry read, "To whoever tends the light after me, the water and the ground beneath it are to remain for the keeper's kin. The world above may sell the view, but the sea remembers its own." Beneath the journal lay a rolled parchment, its edges stiff with salt. Unfolding it carefully, Maggie revealed a deed, stamped by the state of Maine, granting perpetual right of access to the freshwater spring beneath Port Willow Cliff, signed by a maritime court judge long dead. She blinked, stunned. "It's not gold," she whispered, "but it's something." Ranger whined, pawing at the chest as if urging her to keep going. There was also a small map sketched in fading ink, marking the cliff tunnels and lines leading to the old lighthouse, drawn like arteries leading to a heart. That afternoon, she sat in the cramped office of Miguel Alvarez, the only attorney in town who hadn't sold his conscience to Blue Harbor. Miguel was in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked carved from granite softened only by his warm brown eyes. A faint scar ran along his left temple, a reminder, he once mentioned, of a construction accident during his college summers when he had worked to pay tuition. The injury left him cautious, even measured. He spoke slowly, weighing every word like a man defusing a bomb. His desk was cluttered with legal files, coffee rings, and a framed photo of his young daughter holding a seashell. Miguel adjusted his glasses, flipping through the brittle papers Maggie had brought. "This," he said, tapping in the deed, "is extraordinary. If it's authentic, and I believe it is, you may have legal grounds to freeze Blue Harbor's development. The cave, the freshwater source, even the lighthouse access, it all ties to a heritage claim." "So, it could stop them?" Maggie asked, gripping her mug so tightly her knuckles whitened. "It could," he replied, "especially if you can prove the ecological value, say the bioluminescent algae you mentioned, or any nesting wildlife. The law respects heritage, but it protects life." He smiled slightly. "And sometimes, miracles." As she left his office, Maggie noticed two men in dark jackets across the street watching her. They looked out of place, clean boots, new trucks, and that restless stance of people used to power. One of them, a square-jawed man with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses, pretended to smoke while clearly noting her every move. Ranger bared his teeth quietly. "Easy," Maggie murmured, though her stomach nodded. The town was small. Rumors traveled faster than gulls. By nightfall, the whispers had already begun. Someone had found treasure. Someone else said it was a curse. At Gull's Diner, where the evening crowd came for pie and gossip, Eddie leaned over the counter. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Mag," he said, half admiring, half worried. "Heard Blue Harbor's sending a lawyer team next week." Before Maggie could answer, the bell over the door jingled. Her sister Nora Collins stepped in, snow still clinging to her boots. She hadn't changed much. Same willowy frame, chestnut hair cut short in city style, same sharp eyes that used to judge everything and everyone. But the exhaustion around her mouth told a quieter story. Nora dropped her purse on the booth seat and exhaled. "Boston's colder than I remembered. I came to talk, not to fight." Maggie hesitated, then gestured for Eddie to bring coffee. They sat opposite each other, two halves of the same silence. "So," Nora said, stirring her cup, "I heard you're on the radio now. The whole town heard you. You sound happy." "Trying to be," Maggie said. "I also found something that might stop Blue Harbor." She told her about the chest, the deed, the words for keepers. Nora listened, skeptical but intrigued. "You really believe that old paper will save this town?" she asked softly. "I have to," Maggie said. "If we don't keep this place alive, what's left of Mom and Dad? Or of us?" Nora's expression softened, the edge of her voice melting. "You always did find hope in impossible places." Her eyes glistened. "I miss that." Eddie arrived with 2 slices of blueberry pie, just like their mother used to bake. The smell alone pulled a smile from Nora. "To the impossible," she said, raising her fork. They laughed, then cried, and for a while the diner hummed with warmth instead of worry. Outside, snow began to fall lightly, and the town's lights shimmered across the frozen bay. Later that night, as Maggie and Nora walked to the truck, Ranger suddenly stiffened, his nose toward the cliffs. A faint glimmer blinked near the lighthouse again. Brighter this time, then vanished. Maggie and Nora exchanged a glance. "You saw that, right?" Nora whispered. Maggie nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said, "and something tells me it's waiting for us." Chapter 4. The Light of Law and the Shadows of Greed. The morning sky over Port Willow was the color of pewter, heavy with the threat of rain. The sea rolled in slow and deliberate, whispering its secrets against the rocks. Maggie stood at the cliff's edge, her coat flapping in the wind, scanning the dark mouth of the cave below. Something had changed since last night. Ranger's ears twitched. He sniffed the air, nose wrinkling, tail rigid. The scent was new, sharp, bitter, unmistakable. Cigarette smoke. Maggie's pulse tightened. She climbed down the narrow path, boots sliding on slick stone. At the cave's entrance, the evidence was there. 3 cigarette butts, crushed into the damp sand, and a faint boot print leading inward. Someone had been here, and recently. She crouched, tracing the tread with a gloved hand. The pattern was expensive, not the kind fishermen wore. "Blue Harbor," she whispered. Ranger growled, low and steady, the sound rumbling like a warning from the sea itself. Later that day, Maggie drove to the Coastal Research Lab an hour north, the chest and papers safely locked in the truck. The lab stood on a bluff, surrounded by glass greenhouses and salt-streaked railings. Inside, she met Dr. Lan Chen, the marine biologist Sarah had mentioned, a woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones and calm eyes that missed nothing. Her black hair was tied in a neat bun, and she wore a gray cardigan that somehow looked as disciplined as her tone. She had the kind of presence that quieted a room without raising her voice. Lan had come to Maine from Hong Kong 15 years ago, after a coral bleaching study had gone wrong and the government withdrew her funding. The setback had hardened her resolve rather than dimmed it. Lan examined the samples Maggie brought, a vial of the glowing algae, a photo of the spring, and a recording of the faint humming sound the water made. She lifted the vial toward the light. "These organisms," she said, her accent soft but precise, "belong to the genus Pyrocystis, but this strain, this glow pattern, isn't documented anywhere. It reacts to salinity differently. You may have a living fossil here." Maggie blinked. "You mean it's rare?" "Rare enough to make the area legally protected," Lan replied, "especially if paired with a nesting species." "You mentioned birds?" "Yes," Maggie said, "small gray ones. They nest right in the cliff's cracks." "Likely Charadrius nivosus, snowy plovers," Lan said thoughtfully, "endangered in this region. If we document both, Blue Harbor won't touch that site without a federal lawsuit on their hands." Maggie felt the weight of months lift, replaced by a flicker of hope. "Then let's do it." By the following week, Maggie and Lan had filed an emergency conservation petition, an official request to designate the lighthouse area as a temporary heritage and ecological protection zone. It was legal armor forged from truth and patience. But Blue Harbor was already preparing its counterattack. The town hall meeting that evening overflowed with residents. Folding chairs scraped, murmurs rippled through the crowd. At the front, a clean-cut man in a navy suit adjusted the microphone, Richard Hale, Blue Harbor's regional director. He was in his mid-40s, tall and broad, with a politician's smile and eyes that never smiled with it. His hair was slicked back, his tie perfectly knotted. The kind of man, Maggie thought, who probably used the word heritage as a marketing strategy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, "Port Willow deserves progress. Jobs, modernization. Blue Harbor will bring both, along with a waterfront promenade, eco-friendly lodgings, and prosperity." The audience clapped politely, though a few faces looked uneasy. Then Maggie stood. The microphone wavered in her hand, but her voice was steady. "You talk about prosperity," she said, "but this place already has riches, ones you can't pave over. The light on that cliff has guided ships for generations. My father used to tell me that the lighthouse isn't just a tower, it's a promise that someone's watching, even in the storm." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "And now, that light is ours to keep, not to sell." For a heartbeat, silence held the room. Then Ranger, who had been waiting patiently by her side, gave a perfectly timed bark, then another, rhythmic, as if he understood the cadence of her speech. Laughter rippled through the hall, breaking the tension. Someone clapped, then another, and soon the applause grew into a steady, rising roar that filled the rafters. Even Nora, sitting near the back, wiped at her eyes. Lon stepped forward, holding a folder of lab results. "Dr. Lan Chen, Marine Ecology," she said firmly. "We've confirmed the presence of bioluminescent algae and endangered plovers at the site. Under federal code, this grants the area temporary protection. If Blue Harbor proceeds, they'll be violating conservation law." Hale's confident smile faltered for the first time. He leaned toward the microphone. "We'll verify those claims independently." "Please do," Lon said. "Science doesn't fear scrutiny." By the time the meeting ended, the townspeople were buzzing. Outside, Maggie felt the first drops of rain. Nora caught up to her under the awning. "You were incredible," she said, pulling her coat tight. "Mom would have been proud." "I just told the truth," Maggie said. "The rest was Ranger." The dog wagged, utterly unbothered by his newfound fame. That night, the Coast Guard stationed warning signs near the cave entrance, temporary fencing, hazard tape, and a notice declaring it an active conservation zone. Miguel Alvarez filed the supporting papers. For the first time in years, Maggie's land was safe, on paper at least. At home, the fire crackled in the hearth. Nora sat at the table, drafting a letter to potential donors for their new foundation. "The Lighthouse Trust," she said, smiling, "has a ring to it." Maggie poured 2 mugs of cocoa. "How about the Beacon Fund?" Nora laughed. "Even better." From the radio, Eddie's cheerful voice played, "And next weekend, Gull's Diner will host a free chowder night for all local fishermen, courtesy of our new chef, yours truly." Maggie grinned, picturing him in his grease-stained apron, commanding the kitchen like a ship at sea. For the first time in a long while, everything felt right. Until Ranger lifted his head suddenly, ears pricking, eyes fixed toward the window. Outside, a car idled by the road, a dark SUV with its headlights off. When Maggie stood, the engine revved once, then drove away into the fog. She stared after it, the taste of salt thick on her tongue. "They're not done," she murmured. "Not yet." Chapter 5. The door that opened to dawn, morning light spilled across the cliffs like liquid gold, washing away months of fog and fear. The news had come at dawn. The District Court of Knox County had ruled in favor of the people of Port Willow. Maggie stood in front of the lighthouse, the wind tangling her hair, Ranger bounding around her in joyous circles. For the first time in years, the light above her felt truly theirs. Not a relic, not a liability, but a living heart. The court recognized the Port Willow Sea Cave Reserve as a protected heritage and ecological site. The lighthouse was officially transferred to the Lighthouse Trust, the nonprofit Maggie, Nora, Lan, and Eddie had built from nothing but stubborn hope. Maggie smiled through tears as she reread the letter, stamped with the official seal. "We did it, boy," she whispered. Ranger barked once, then promptly stole the envelope and sprinted down the path, tail wagging like a victory flag. Weeks later, Port Willow shimmered with a new rhythm. The once forgotten town had transformed, not into a resort, but into something purer. The lighthouse now doubled as a rescue and research center, where volunteers studied marine life by day and guided visitors through bioluminescent tours by night. Inside, the old lamp room gleamed again, restored with brass fittings and a new Fresnel lens that cast a clean, steady light across the bay. Sarah Donovan coordinated tours and exhibits, now wearing her gray coat like a captain's uniform. She had a knack for storytelling, turning every display into a living memory. "This," she would say to visitors, pointing at an old brass lantern, "is what kept our fathers and brothers alive when the sea was at its worst." Her voice carried the warmth of someone who'd fought quietly for beauty all her life. Dr. Lan Chen had taken up semi-permanent residence in Port Willow, converting the small keeper's cottage into a marine lab. She spent her mornings observing the glowing algae, her evenings walking the cliffs with a camera and notebook. The tangle of instruments on her desk, flasks, scanners, tiny jars labeled Pyrocystis species, looked like relics from a science fair dream. For the first time since Hong Kong, she allowed herself to laugh freely, the kind of laugh that fog couldn't muffle. Nora Collins, meanwhile, had opened a cozy bookshop and cafe at the lighthouse's base. She called it the Keeper's Shelf, its shelves lined with maritime journals, sea folklore, and stories of survival. Some nights, she read aloud to small groups of locals and travelers, her voice gentle, firm, finally at peace with the town she once tried to forget. On the wall hung a black and white photo of their mother, apron dusted with flour, smiling beside a pie. Eddie Callahan, true to his word, became the heartbeat of the harbor kitchen. His Lighthouse blueberry pie turned famous, not for its sweetness, but for the memory it carried. "I added sea salt to the crust," he'd say proudly, "because no one in this town's life was ever sugar alone." His diner was packed every Friday night, fishermen shoulder to shoulder with college researchers, laughter spilling like waves against the window. And Ranger was now the unofficial mascot of Port Willow Rescue. His picture hung on every poster, tongue lolling, eyes bright. The only battle he ever lost was against the pink life vest Nora bought him. The first time she strapped it on, he froze solid, refusing to move. The entire dock burst into laughter. From that day, the vest stayed nailed to the wall as a decoration, labeled "Uniform Rejected by Chief Ranger." Maggie found her rhythm again. She hosted a weekly radio show from the Lighthouse, telling stories of the coast, the shipwrecked, the saved, and the steadfast. Her voice, once tentative, now rolled like the tide, strong, warm, sure of its place in the world. The mailbox overflowed with letters from across Maine, fishermen thanking her for saving the bay, students asking to volunteer, widows writing that her words helped them believe in the light again. One evening, after the last visitor had gone, and the sea turned silver under a rising moon, Maggie climbed the spiral stairs to the top of the lighthouse. Nora followed, 2 mugs of cocoa in hand. The lantern rotated slowly, its beam sweeping across the dark like a watchful eye. "Hard to believe, isn't it?" Nora said softly. "That it's over?" Maggie smiled. "Or that it's beginning?" They stood in silence, watching the horizon. The night was calm, the kind of quiet that hummed with gratitude. Down below, Ranger barked at the incoming tide, his reflection shimmering in the water's glow. The beam from the lighthouse cut through the mist and fell upon the sea cave entrance. No longer a shadowed wound, but a portal of light. Maggie turned to her sister. "You ever think," she murmured, "that the sea gives back to those who listen?" Nora squeezed her hand. Maybe it never took. Maybe it was just waiting. The light turned, washing over them, over the bay, over the sleeping town that had found its way home again. And for the briefest moment, Maggie thought she heard voices on the wind, old keepers whispering, waves speaking their endless vow. The sea returns its heart to those who walk into darkness, carrying light. Ranger barked again, tail wagging, as if to agree. The sisters laughed, the sound rising up through the lantern glass, carried far and wide by the eternal light of Port Willow. Sometimes, God hides his miracles not in thunder or flame, but in salt water, quiet hands, and the hearts of those who keep believing when no one else does. Maggie didn't find gold or fame beneath the lighthouse. She found something far greater, proof that light never belongs to one person. It belongs to everyone who refuses to let darkness win. Maybe that's what faith truly is, not waiting for a miracle to happen, but becoming part of the miracle yourself. The sea, like God's grace, gives back to those who listen with love. So tonight, if you feel lost, remember the keepers of Port Willow. Remember that even in your darkest storm, there's a light already burning for you, placed there by the same hands that made the stars. If this story touched your heart, share it so the light can travel farther. Leave a comment. Tell us what light means to you. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep this circle of faith and hope alive. And may the Lord bless you, keep you, and guide you home, just as he guided Maggie through the storm.